used to him running over at the deadline to hand in our tape.
I know the feeling well.
Sliding through the door.
Yeah, right. Oh, you still got all those tapes? Yeah?
Yes, we just actually donated them to the tenement library.
Okay, we can talk about that. And welcome very much to Conversations. It's a pleasure to welcome to Conversations Judith LeBlanc, and she's the co-chair of the United for Peace and Justice, the organizations which has had such a hand in organizing opposition to the Iraq War demonstration so effectively. It's a major organization for peace, and Judith, welcome very much to Conversation. Great pleasure talking.
Thanks for the invite.
My pleasure, indeed. And we were just chatting because I just live down the street from where your office is, and that's getting to be a lot of things are moving to Schmata Row, you know, to the garment district now. But in any event, I wonder if you could, because we do this, we have 58 minutes, but I'm wondering if maybe we're going to talk about United and you know, some of the state of the world. I know you've just come back from a journey or visit to Lebanon, which is a target area that we could talk about. But could you share your own personal background a little bit, please? Where you were born and raised, that sort of thing. And then we'll get into a discussion about the human condition, politics, and I think you have a demonstration coming up in September being called, those kind of things. But could you share your own background, please?
Well, I'm a member of the Caddo tribe of Oklahoma.
Caddo?
Caddo. Originally from Louisiana, a few in Texas. Very small tribe.
You get out there through the Trail of Tears?
Yes, my great-grandparents. And my parents met, my mom's and dad met while my father was in the Army. So I was born at Fort Hood, Texas, which for me is it's actually a wonderful thing, because Fort Hood became the center of the GI resistance during the Vietnam War.
No,
in
really?
fact, the first soldiers who resisted going to Vietnam, a black, a Latino, and white draftees refused to go, and they were called the Fort Hood Three.
No kidding. When would that have been? Do you remember? Or maybe you don't remember.
It was in the, well, I was little, but it was sometime in the early 60s, because they were the first refusers.
Right.
So it's always been a source of pride for me to have been born there. And I grew up, as you can tell, my formative linguistic years were in Massachusetts. My dad was from Massachusetts, so I have the trademark Kennedy
twang.
And so my family is from Oklahoma and Massachusetts. My father's family, they were mill workers, leather and shoe workers, and
your
I
mother?
moved to New York. And my mom did a lot of domestic work. And even both my parents didn't graduate from high school, but really worked very hard. And my mom got her GED and became a licensed practical nurse. And my mom is back in Oklahoma. And my dad has passed away. But the interesting thing about my family is that because it was a biracial family, growing up, some of my strongest memories were of my family trying to find a way to deal with many of the problems that racism brings for a biracial family. My family was very active in the Methodist Church, and basically I give a lot of credit to the Methodist Church for my political involvement, because we had so many different ways during the 60s to become involved in the huge mass movements that changed the course of history. The minister of our church is very progressive and wanted the young people, the Methodist Youth Fellowship, to be going to demonstrations supporting the farm workers during the boycotts. We even heard Dr. King speak on Boston Common. So I credit the Methodist Church for my activism.
You would have been, that's interesting, you would have been too young to have been at the 63 thing in Washington. Yeah, okay, you were too young for that. But you were an adult at the time of Vietnam, 68, 69?
I was in high school.
You were in high school.
And it was also the beginnings of the movement, the American Indian movement, and I became one of those young Indian people who became involved in support work around Alcatraz. I helped to launch, I even still
They
have
seized
the
Alcatraz, didn't they? Yeah.
Yes, and I helped collect tons of canned food in support of the people who were occupying, because it went on for so long. It became a big thing in the town where I lived in Massachusetts, that young people were supporting the American Indian movement. And later, ironically enough, I participated in a World Youth Festival in 1973 in what was then called East Berlin in the German Democratic Republic, where youth from all over the world came together who were fighting colonialism, who young people from the United States. There were over 300 young people from the United States there. I met people from the American Indian movement who were working in South Dakota at Pine Ridge Indian Reservation.
Right, yeah.
And I got the opportunity to go and work on the res, to do pretrial investigative work for the Wounded Knee Support Committee. I recently returned to Pine Ridge and actually helped to lead some anti-war organizing workshops of youth from Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, some of whom were the grandchildren of people that I worked with in 1973 during the Wounded Knee occupation.
Wow, Wounded Knee, yeah, that was...
Full circle.
Right, full circle. You're politically organized, you're progressive. I could ask you what exactly is progressive, but have you been political your whole adult life, and what caused you to be political? And you're very much of an activist and so forth. Maybe that, and then some of your education, did you go to university and that sort of thing, or?
Well, that's a sore point. I hope my mom doesn't see the show, but my family, my father was active in the labor movement. He was an electrical worker. He was out at one point for 6 months on strike. And being active in the Methodist Church, a lot of those things came together, the racial oppression. When I went to Wounded Knee, in a lot of ways, it brought together for me the idea that racism is not just a system of bad ideas and wrong things that are done by white people, that it's very systematic, and that the government does perpetrate and organize the racist system that keeps people of color in the lower parts of society, and that really, in the bottom line, is that the corporations generate these divisions to maintain their hegemony in society.
You picked up on that early in life, right?
Early.
Was your dad activist?
Very active.
He was activist in the union movement and progressively minded.
No, not really. I think he was more, I would say now, more in the political center, and sometimes maybe tending towards the right. I think he voted for Goldwater. But the activism and the solidarity, especially during that one strike where my father was out for 6 months, I saw how the families came together, what happened at the Union Hall, what it was like when scabs would try to cross the picket line, and that had a big influence on me. But I think the Methodist Church and being able to discuss the social issues of the day, trying to understand these huge mass movements that were developing around the civil rights movement and the Great Boycott, led me to become involved in some union organizing. I did go to college at the University of Massachusetts in a program at Amherst. A program. It was the largest minority student enrollment in 1970 that had ever been for the university. I went on a Bureau of Indian Affairs scholarship. But after going to this World Youth Festival, meeting people from Wounded Knee, Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, I, like so many of my generation, quit because I decided I went to South Dakota. I lived there for a year, and I felt that being involved in political organizing was something that gave my life a lot of meaning, and it was a slow but very slippery slope to where I am today, because I've remained as an organizer since then. So I've been doing over 30 years of organizing on a cross-section of issues.
And you got going on with the American Indian movement. There was a lot going on then. Is it still active, or things are settling down on that front? There was a lot of Vernon Bellecourt is a dear friend of mine, and the seizing of the building, I think, in Washington and Alcatraz. Is that still going, or is it settling now as far as that? Because it seems to me, a Trail of Tears and the whole, it seems to me the colonial, European colonial, seizers of this continent, they took this continent over. They violated virtually every treaty we had with the Aboriginal people here, and it's a
continuing, very difficult story, and the struggle against the problems. I mean, Pine Ridge Indian Reservation is kind of a laboratory to study. I mean, it has the highest unemployment rate, the highest incidence of common diseases that are eradicated in the rest of the population. There's a very high suicide rate, and in the war in Iraq, during the war in Iraq, there's been predatory military recruitment practices that really do violate laws. And so you have, for a tribe that's about the size of 18,000, a small town, you have 800 people from that tribe serving in Iraq.
Wow, because
there's no jobs,
there's no opportunity,
there's predatory recruiting, making promises to youth who see their families 80% unemployed. I think
80%.
80% on that reservation,
Uh-huh.
many reservations. And I think what you're seeing now is a certain surge in the last few years, especially under the Bush administration, where there's a new kind of activism that involves being involved in electoral politics. In South Dakota, in that area where Pine Ridge Indian Reservation is, they had a huge number of Indians get elected to local office. But during the election, on election day, the right wing in South Dakota, South Dakota was targeted by the far right, and Bush went there many times. They tried to prevent Indian people from voting.
Really?
And in fact, state police were stopping cars on the highways. When you live on a reservation, you have a number that's on your license plate, so they'd stop, ask people for IDs, ask people where they were going.
Racial profiling.
Racial profiling. In fact, some of the organizers that I know there who were working to get the vote out had to call the Democratic National Headquarters and expose it. They got on the radio, and finally, there was some relief, but it was a real attack on the right of Indian people to be a part of democracy.
Been treating them badly since the beginning and still are.
And there's a fight
very real
against it.
sense. And this goes on in the Americas, for that matter. I mean, because the treatment of I lived for 2 years in Bolivia among the Aymara. I'm very happy to see that the president of the country for the first time is now an Aymara.
It's fantastic.
And I've lived among those people for a long time. That's a rich cultural area. They had a civilization at the time of Christ that rivaled the old world based on a whole unique food complex. They had they went all the way up to Venezuela. And there are things and now they've got for the first time an Aboriginal Aymara president.
It's fantastic.
And I think there are good signs, some good signs coming out of Latin America, not the least of which also is Mr. Chavez. I think the election in Mexico was a little bit questionable, don't you? I mean, the election down there, do you think there was fraud or anything that was nefarious as far as the election in Mexico? Because
all I know
there was
is what the people are doing there and how they have fought for every vote to be counted, just as we unfortunately tried to do in the last 2 elections. And frankly, there's been so much good in the world and so many advances over hundreds of years. To see the Bush administration taking this planet to the edge of destruction is awful, and it's something that
you see them taking the planet to the edge of destruction.
Yes.
So that's the thing. Now, okay, you've had all that background, and you've been politically active, and you've been organizing things. Now, the United for Peace and Justice got started as a result of the Iraq incursion, right? I mean,
exactly.
It got started before it was what was the gestation of it? And what were your involvements before that in terms of political organizing? There was a lot going on before 2002, you know, but maybe you could share some of that and how you got involved in activist political stance in the country and the world.
Well, United for Peace and Justice is kind of like the Immaculate Conception.
Oh, really? Okay.
It's really a mystery how, in some ways, it continues to grow. But how it was founded is that groups, many of the traditional peace groups that had been doing work on disarmament and other wars, since the U.S. history is littered with wars and occupations.
A number of people that weren't called United for Peace, but they had been doing anti-war work over a long haul.
Over many decades came together when the threat was mounting to, that Bush administration was clear was driving to make war on Iraq. And we became a part of the International Day of Action, the call for an International Day of Action. The world says no to war on February 15th,
well, that was
2003.
Huge.
It was huge. Many groups came together.
Oh, it was huge, all over the world.
I became involved in the organizing of February 15th, and that was before United for Peace and Justice was, actually a full-blown coalition where groups came together. We had our founding National Assembly shortly after the war began, but the interesting thing about United for Peace and Justice is that it brought to the table in the struggle to try to stop the war and after the war began to try to end the war and the occupation, groups that have done traditionally for decades organizing for peace and disarmament, along with groups that grew out of this war, like the Iraq Veterans Against the War, the Gold Staff Families, Military Families Speak Out, U.S. Labor Against the War, and, which are national formations, and a whole array of local community grassroots coalitions that came together to organize to stop this war. So you have, in many cities, groups that came together that involved religious folks, youth groups, community groups, labor folks, who decided that in their own community they needed to organize, to organize to participate in national actions, but
some of those
to
people
organize to continue to educate people about what is going on and how to empower people at the grassroots movement. So it's a wonderful organism. It's very historic. It is the largest coalition in the country. There's over 1,300 member groups.
1,300 member groups.
Joining.
Okay.
Groups keep joining, and there are groups.
Now, what were those people doing before the Iraq War? I mean, the various groups that came to be united or under your banner, they still exist as their own entities, but they're uniting for certain things that you call, and you can get effective. Where was all that? There was no united effort like that previously to that?
Not on
It
this
all
scale.
been diverse and divided? There was
Exactly.
There was a lot of, if you're too young perhaps to remember, you know, except as a very young person, Vietnam, there was a whole lot of activity took place in many, many different dimensions that sort of like Stokely Carmichael, you said, it just jumped up all over the world and created and there was a lot of anti-war sentiment in the society before the Iraq War.
And to be sure, that residue and those activists jumped whole hog into the organizing against the war in Iraq. But there are many people who thought they would never protest anything, who never were in a demonstration, and that's what is so powerful about this political moment.
And that's what turned the tide in Vietnam. There were a lot of people. I can remember when we went in '67 from a university. I was teaching university in Utah. We went to San Francisco. They had a march there. We had to push the baby. My wife and I, we had to push the baby in one of their stroller and everything. We went and we had helped organize these people to drive from Logan, Utah, way out in Utah, to San Francisco. And we made a little caravan of the cars that were going to go off. And there were some citizens who threw eggs at our car because they thought we were being disloyal and that sort of thing. And so, and then it finally got down to when Mr. Nixon or Mr. Johnson had to retire from the presidency, it was because there was a mass movement of the whole population that was absolutely undeniably saying no more, and it finally got, and it took an awful lot of deaths on this side and chaos over there as they kept upping the ante and so forth, but it became a mass movement, and finally Mr. Cronkite, our Mr. Newsman of reputation, of impeachable reputation, put a word in, and so it became a mass thing. You're trying to get a mass movement going against this war or something, and does it make a difference whether you're doing that or whether you're zeroing in on a particular agenda of a group or something?
It does make a difference. I think that the groups that have come together, there are many groups that have their own agenda. They do things.
Do you ever talk to Trotskyites? They all have a very different interpretation, and they will argue to the death over beer in the saloon somewhere about Schachmann or something. And you know what I mean? It's wonderful in a way, but you know, it's a lot of
United
division.
for Peace and Justice is not a debating society. It's an action. It's an action coalition. It's people do things together. I think that one of the most important examples of the impact that a coalition of this character can have is that we made a conscious effort and helped to establish, within the framework of the coalition, a legislative action working group.
Legislative action working
that
group.
would
To work on the
focus
Congress,
on
you mean, or what?
Pressuring Congress.
Okay.
Pressuring and protesting the right-wing warmongers, but on the other hand, pressuring and helping those on Capitol Hill who were not the majority, who opposed the war from the very beginning. Some of our Congress people here in New York City, for example, to help guide, pressure, and help them be stronger in opposing the war. And so what you
help
saw...
them be stronger by educating?
Educating and knowing and finding out that the majority of their constituents want them to speak out against the war, encouraging them when different opportunities arise to introduce legislation. For instance, this year, during the appropriations discussion, when the bill came up, there were resolutions, amendments that were made by a cross-section of Congress people to the appropriations bill that were attempting to cut the funding for the bill, that were a very important amendment that was made to not fund anything that would lead to permanent bases in Iraq.
Well,
and it passed in the House and the Senate, no permanent bases by voice vote.
What are that they're building? Those look awfully like permanent facilities over there that I see newsreel footage of and so forth.
That's the point. It passed in both houses, and then in the Reconciliation Committee, it was put back in. And so the need to
Yeah,
focus...
really? Like an
Yes,
earmark or something?
Yes.
Or
So the need to focus
it was
the
put back
energies.
in after it had been eliminated, and that can happen like as yeah, okay. It's like they say, don't watch sausage or legislation being made because it's a nasty process. You're following on top of that.
Exactly. So
okay, among other things, yeah.
We've created a local network of people who are keeping an eye on their local congresspeople and are in many ways helping to empower the grassroots opposition. Because it's not enough to oppose the war. We have to compel Congress to end the war, to cut the funding.
Were the people that are involved in Uniting for Peace and Justice against the incursion into Afghanistan following 9/11?
Well, that's what's very interesting. I think that right after September 11th, there were many, many groups who, from all the movements, who were afraid to say anything. They were afraid.
Well,
there
that's
was
been
a certain stun.
That seems to me that's been characteristic of our so-called loyal opposition in the Congress on the Democratic side right along. They've been just absolutely almost moribund in far as voting
things
for
have
the
been changing because the people,
well, it's changing
public
now
opinion
because
is
the
changing.
public opinion is changing. Yeah,
Exactly.
right. Yeah.
So right after September 11th, there was kind of a stunned silence, and many of the groups that are in United for Peace and Justice that had been working nationally for
1,300,
peace.
you say?
We have 1,300 now, yes,
Okay.
over 1,300. Well, many of the groups nationally that had been working previously on peace and justice issues got together and called a demonstration here in New York on October 10th.
October 10th, what year now?
Against the war in Afghanistan.
October 10th when?
2001.
2001, just after...
September 11th.
Well, that was just after September 2001.
It was the first action.
Against the idea that they were ginning up for a war.
Exactly.
Yeah, I see, yeah.
Exactly.
And you were against it.
And
I mean,
people were organizing.
The organization was against it, and people who were against it were for it. But there was an awful lot of support for that war, wasn't there?
There was, but
compared to Iraq.
things shifted. Things began to change. After that October demonstration, a lot of the national groups got together and said, we need to do something. A demonstration was planned for April 2002.
Right.
It was the first peace demonstration after September 11th. There were over 60,000 people.
Was this United for Peace and Justice
This was
then, or
the
was
beginnings. There were many
of
of the
different
groups.
Name?
There were many groups that came together, national peace groups that are now in the leadership of United for Peace and Justice, that helped to bring over 60,000 people to Washington, D.C.
And what did they call themselves then?
I think it was the April. I worked on it, but I think it was like the April demonstration.
You were involved in that early on thing, and you were against the bombing of Iraq, Afghanistan.
Because many of the
You're
people.
You're a peace-oriented person, is that it?
Yes, just like many of the people who were affected by September 11th. I know that I was down at Ground Zero from September 12th on. Many of the construction workers that I interviewed and wrote a number of articles on, in the subsequent anniversaries, the first anniversary of September 11th, construction workers said to me, they should not make war in my name. One wrong is bad enough, but two wrongs to now start bombing Afghanistan?
But you had a lot of people who were really out to get those sons of guns that did it.
There were, but there were also people who had second thoughts, who maybe weren't organized, maybe weren't speaking out. But that sentiment among the American people of doing the right thing, of when the American people find out facts and realize that, for example, Bush lied in order to launch the war in Iraq, that's what kind of propels the building of a movement. And United for Peace and Justice, had we not existed, it wouldn't be necessarily so that 60% of the people oppose the war in Iraq right now.
Oh, yeah.
Because
been a big
on one
change,
hand,
the
situation in Iraq
shifted. Yeah, it's probably shifted
bad.
from about 30 to 60 or something like that. Yeah.
And before the war, it was a majority. Once the war started, there was a slip back.
Okay, and do you all investigate about why and what's behind it and what's the idea behind it? Because they did lie. Do you think they were misinformed? Do you think it was because they go back to the 70s? Mr. Wolfowitz goes back to the 70s. He's been pushing to have Iraq defanged and so forth since the 70s in the Project for the New Century. They had this in place, and they had this in place for a very long period of time, did they not?
Exactly. And just as in Lebanon, there was a grand plan that the neoconservatives were mapping out for control of the region.
Okay,
Iraq
now
was one piece of it.
What do you think is behind, let's say, in the Iraq thing? You had Iraq was a nation of a large population relative, and they also had oil. You had a combination. They also had a reputation for being fierce, effective, dogged fighters in war, in the wars that had occurred, let's say, with Israel and so forth. They had that thing, so that they wanted to break up. They bombed their nuclear reactor preemptorily in 1981. They wanted to do. Is there any tie-in, do you think, between Wolfowitz and these neocons and maybe some Likudnik elements of Israel about wanting to have a possible threat to Israel just defanged or put out of business or something like that, that was behind the impetus by the neocons to gin up and go against knowledge that they had that there were no weapons of mass destruction in order to eliminate as a potential threat to our ally Israel the effective state of Iraq?
Well, I think the starting point is the far right and the Bush administration's plans for the world.
All right.
I mean, I think, you know, one of the things that is so critical is for us in the peace movement to try to help connect the dots between what is happening, what has happened in Lebanon, and what is happening in Iraq, and how the neoconservatives, the far right, and the Bush administration is trying to destabilize that entire region.
The entire region, yeah.
In order to not only control the resources, but to exert political control of the region. I mean, their grand plan, and if you listen to what Condoleezza Rice said leading in the course of the month-long war on Lebanon, she said things like, these are the birth pangs of a new Middle East.
Yeah, right.
And that Israel is on the forefront of the clash of civilizations.
Yeah, well, it's
defending Western civilization.
Yeah.
And when you think about
like the
what
white
has
man's
happened,
burden, that's been the theme song of the colonizing efforts of Europeans for the last 500 years, it seems to me.
And so you have...
And Israel is seen as part of an Ashkenazi European extension into that part of the world, like a colonizing power that's going to whip the wogs into shape.
Well, I think that,
you know, maybe that's a little loaded language, but they used to call them gooks in Vietnam. Then they called them wogs, as the British did under colonial rule of that area, and that Israel just continues, or is seen to continue, in that Western imperialist colonizing attitude of Europeans toward other peoples of the world of a lesser race or a lesser way of being.
I think the U.S. and the Bush administration and the far right are attempting to use Israel, and I think what's very interesting is what's going on in Israel today.
And is Israel trying to use the United States?
Well, I
which
mean,
is the dog and which is the tail?
Well, the dog is definitely U.S. imperialism when they're pumping the amount of money that it does every year into the Israeli budget.
Over
but look at what's happening.
I think.
Exactly. But look what's happening among the Israeli people. I mean, the policies of the U.S. are making the lives of Israelis much more difficult, economically, socially, but are creating a situation where the Israeli people are suffering.
Well,
and during the month of the war in Lebanon, for example, one thing that is not covered in mainstream media is that there were over 100 peace demonstrations in Israel. There were 2 of several thousand in Tel Aviv. Do you know what their main demands were? We will not be the pawn of the U.S. government and the Bush administration. Number 2, negotiate with Hezbollah. Number 3, calling upon the Israeli soldiers not to obey the immoral order to fight a war in Lebanon.
Okay.
So one of the things that's happened is that people, I think, don't understand that the Israeli people are suffering just as the U.S. people suffer because of foreign policies or policies of war and using unilateral militarism to solve very complex political problems.
Well, we could look at this and say, is it the Iraq War, or is it the system here, or one group, a cabal in the United States has taken over, or is it the system? Some people could say that, let's say, latter-day capitalism is the problem in the world, that we need a new way of organizing Spaceship Earth and to have something that brings some justice to the masses. That's the basic problem. Other people will say, well, it's just this group. If we get rid of them and maybe we get the Democrats in or something, then everything will be okay. And then on the other side, as far as the Israeli thing, it's interesting because it's coming into play now, was the idea itself of Zionism a mistake as far as securing the security of the Jewish people among the peoples of the world?
Well, I think the starting point. I think the starting point really is how given the history, given the history of the region, how can we bring about peace in the region? And the only way to bring about peace in the region, both for the Israeli people and for the peoples of all of the countries, starting with the Palestinians, is to follow through, and implement international obligations. All of the resolutions that have been passed to help establish a state.
248.
Exactly, a state for the Palestinian people that can live side by side with Israel, that can have a future without constant illegal occupation. That's the bottom line. Once you solve that question, once you solve that question of a state for the Palestinians, all the countries in that region will have a different relationship to the borders of Israel.
Oh, that's interesting, because Israel is a superpower. They've won at least 3 wars against a huge, and you got 1.4 billion Muslims, and you have to give them high marks for chutzpah at being able to go against the tide of anti-colonialism, which was characteristic of the Second World War, for Europeans to go and set themselves up in a situation where they knew they were going to get reaction against the people that were there in a colonizing manner like that. You have to give them high marks for chutzpah. And then they get unlimited support from the United States. They have Apache attack helicopters. They got the latest so they've become, in the minds of many people in the world, an absolutely invincible, facts on the ground state that is so strong that it cannot be challenged. And I wonder if you think, and yet in the hearts of many of the people of the Arab country, King Abdullah made that thing where they said, we will accept Israel, that sort of thing. They were forced to that, in a certain sense, by the power of Israel. Now, with Nasrallah, and on the very last day of the incursion, they were lobbing rockets into Haifa, and that invincible notion of Israel as being invincible, and behind them the invincibility of the United States with their model for the world, that may be being brought into question by the people of the Arab, and maybe the Muslim, and maybe the broader world that is not being served by the interests that are being advanced by those 2 political entities. I wonder if that makes any sense to you, and that the thing has changed, and they don't have to accept the idea of the inevitability of Israel.
Well, I think Israel is a country
It may be a mistake. It may have been a mistake, is what I'm saying.
What I think is important, though, to consider is that the Middle East is not hegemonic. It is not just Muslims. There's a long tradition and history of Semitic peoples, of Christians.
Yeah, a lot of Maronites in Lebanon, for
and
sure.
And it is also the cradle of all 3 religions, Christian, Judaism, and Islam. And so
just over the horizon, you got Zoroaster over in Iran. That's being brought into
So how the peoples can live together in peace in that region is something that needs to be contemplated with an eye to reality, to the history of the region. But the truth is that military might is not going to solve the historic problems in that region.
I think the animus directed against Israel is at a all-time high, and the animus directed against the United States is at an all-time, maybe crucially, qualitatively different attitude toward the supposed superpower of these 2 entities that try to assert Western colonial, beat the wogs into shape attitude among the people. The Emir of Qatar.
It wasn't simply a military. It was not simply a military situation.
It's like Bernard Lewis.
Public opinion, diplomatic initiatives,
exactly.
and the pressure. No matter how much Bush said, keep bombing, keep bombing. The world was speaking out against it, calling for a ceasefire. And what we have now is a historic opportunity for diplomatic, international law and national sovereignty, principles based on national sovereignty, to be implemented.
Well,
that's what the American people need to press the Congress.
Okay, I'm saying
it has always been placed as simply a military battle.
Well, the military is part of geostrategic thinking. Military is there.
But it's been placed as simply a military battle.
And do you remember Bernard Lewis? All the things Bernard Lewis has written about the Arabs only understand power. They're like some sort of lower Ubermenschen. They only understand power. You got to whip them into shape. That's the message they've been given, and they've done it. And they've taken that attitude, and they've got an aggressive attitude toward that. And now, and they've all come to accept it. We can't fight this great power, but now they're beginning. And I saw the Emir of Qatar, where the forces from Saudi Arabia have gone now, and he came on the television, and he had Nasrallah and all the stuff going on in Lebanon, and they were expecting, the so-called international community media were expecting him to say, well, we got to disarm them and that sort of thing. And he came out and he sang the praises of Nasrallah and said he's given a new impetus to the Arab world to face up to the fact that Israel is not invincible.
Well, let me tell you
and
something.
they're there with 1.4 billion Muslims, and it may be that there's going to be pressure put on Israel. They're not going to be able to take the attitude that we are invincible, and they will. Remember when Arafat was in Ramallah and they rolled him with 4,000 tanks and put the gun right in his bathroom and stuck it in, and they couldn't lift up a stone, let alone a pebble or a stone? Now they've attacked, and it's because of the geostrategic backing of Iran and others that gave them the ability to fight and see this may be a paper tiger, and there may be great pressures coming on Israel.
Well, I think it's very dangerous, especially
of course
for those
it's dangerous.
of us who sit here in the United States to perpetrate the myth that Israel could be defeated militarily.
Well, wait a minute.
The fact is that
they could.
The fact is that, and we all know, even though Israel has not admitted it, the world knows that Israel has
at least a couple hundred
nuclear capability.
Right, and they've got a narrative that they believe in.
And what I think is critical, I think is critical, and what the Lebanese people see as critical, is that the Lebanese people are not simply the pawns of U.S. foreign policy, that they are a nation that is fighting for national integrity. They were in the middle of a national accord dialogue before this war began, and they are 16 months into a new government. And what I saw there on the ground is that people said, we are not Muslims, we are not Christians, we are not Jews, we are Lebanese. And if the U.S. stopped supplying arms to Israel, they would not be able to do this.
Try and get them to stop. So they've been sending arms as fast as they possibly can and ginning it all up so they have Apache helicopters to beat the bejesus out of the Palestinians.
But the truth is, as I
that's been the pattern, has it not been for decades?
If we
and the question is why? What is there that's in our interest as Americans to support that colonial power like that we have? And shouldn't it be questioned by some people in order to bring some back?
And that's what, and
now,
that's exactly what's going on in this country today.
Is there a differentiation
among? There is a questioning of what happened in Lebanon, because
people,
now
what happened in
people.
What happened in Lebanon?
Let me start from here, though.
The unquestioned support, unlimited support to the state of Israel to buy weapons to beat the Palestinians into submission.
But I think,
why are we doing that? What's in our national interest to do that? Is that being brought up?
I think that that's what's happening. With Lebanon, people saw incredible humanitarian crisis. People saw Bush, a president that's led us into an immoral war that is destroying Iraq.
Absolutely.
People are open to the question. I've been doing media interviews every day, 2 to 3 times, national radio call-in talk shows, including on right-wing shows.
Right.
People are questioning. Now, do they know the answers? Do they know the truth? Well, the fact is that cluster bombs, that Reagan put a moratorium for 6 years on the sale of cluster bombs to Israel because they had used it in Lebanon before, and that there was a secret agreement that now the State Department is investigating. You know why? Because there's been an outcry. There were people calling Congress, the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, U.S. Campaign to End the Israeli Occupation, the American Friends Service Committee, many peace groups were calling Congress people, we must stop this expedited delivery of cluster bombs. We have to review whether or not Israel has broken law. There are laws that govern how the arms that we sell to Israel.
Why just cluster bombs?
That's why the grassroots movement is critical to cutting the arms sales to Israel.
Why just cluster bombs? Why is it? It's just no.
I saw Holbrook. There was an expedited.
I saw Holbrook the other day on television. He's talking and he's saying, "Well, it's absolutely certain that we have no choice but to be the undying supporter of Israel." That's it. That's in stone. Why?
Well,
why do we take that position when it's not in our interest? And that question should be questioned, or should it? There are many people in the peace movement who feel Israel is a sacred thing. They don't want to have that question brought up.
That's changing a great deal.
You think so?
Because of what happened in Lebanon. It's a teaching moment.
That's what I was trying to, and it was coming out of what happened in Lebanon because Lebanon won the war. It wasn't because of some,
I'm talking about the American people.
Yeah.
When the American people see that kind of suffering, they're not just a blank slate. People react to that when they see Bush. Look, Bush is.
Well, that's like a metaphor for the United States in the war. That's a metaphor for the United States in Iraq, is it not?
Exactly, and we have to put our shoes, and what the peace movement of the U.S. has to do is to place ourselves in the shoes of the Israeli people, the Lebanese people, and the Iraqi people.
Wait a minute.
The majority of people in those countries are suffering because our government is waging an illegal war and causing war crimes.
Well, I'm getting back to you. You didn't ask me. I mean, how much of the thing about the Iraq incursion had to do with neocons' paranoia to protect Israel, and this commitment that we have to protect Israel? How much of it has been built around that, and their ideas also of seeing themselves as a superpower, a greater power, to have control over the whole area? Let's destroy the whole Arab world so that we can take over control as a satrap to the United States. What is the tie between those two, and what are the people in the peace movement? No, I haven't answered. I've asked you. What do you think?
But that is the answer.
What?
The neoconservatives have a plan for the world that flows from the idea of being the sole superpower.
And Israel is to be our...
And they want to remap the Middle East.
Israel's to be our, what do you call it, pit bull lapdog in this thing, and that we're going to support them, and why? That's what I'm asking you, the Israeli thing, because that's what it sticks in the craw of so many, and the thing is changing. The Arab world is not longer saying we have to accept this. Do you think they're going to disarm Hezbollah? Do you think Iran is going to stop disarming Hezbollah? Do you think the Emir of Qatar said, we are going to start supporting Hezbollah? Hezbollah is now giving $12,000 to people to buy their new home that they can do. They're social agency. Hamas is a social agency. So the idea that whatever Israel thinks or whatever they want is something that's got to be vouchsafed by American arms and so forth is coming into question. That's going to change the geostrategic structure, I think, and it's going to be at the cost of a great number of people who are going to be upset who are committed to the idea of the state of Israel, which may have been from the get-go a mistake like Vietnam.
Well, I don't agree with you there. I think genocide, fascism, the atrocities that were committed during World War II, the international community moved to address it, and the Semitic peoples had a history in that region. Now, there are many, many resolutions that to implement those decisions that have never been carried out. In the first place, a contiguous state with the capital shared and Jerusalem as the capital, it has never been implemented. And until that is done, there will not be peace in that region. There'll be consistent and continuous problems around borders. But I think the starting point to understand the situation is, in order for the Israeli people to live a decent life, and for the Palestinian people, and for the people of Lebanon, and Syria, and Iran, we have to take a look at what is driving the U.S. foreign policy at this point. And what is driving it is what you say, that the idea that we are the sole superpower, the oil-rich region, but we also want to control the political life there and the economic life. You know,
130 countries we have forces in 130 countries now.
Exactly. But
what kind of nonsense is that?
The interesting thing.
And we don't have a vision worthy of following. We don't have a political organization that does anything but serve the upper class. Exactly. In every country, every political entity, you know, they're like running dogs that go with our thing, and our system is not one that's worthy of following. So I'm saying that is there a system building in the world to challenge the assumed legitimacy of the United States of America and their running dog allies because they're out of date with what the zeitgeist requires? Something new is required, and we should keep an opening on that possibility. And where is it from?
Well, we got to start with the issue of democracy.
Okay.
The fact is that Lebanon and in Palestine, there are democratically elected governments.
Hamas.
That the U.S.
I think they would like to overturn that election.
And Hezbollah, they were democratically elected governments that the U.S. has targeted to undermine and destabilize.
Of course, that's what they do.
And when, on the one hand, Bush says we're bringing democracy to that region of the world, and on the other hand, in Iraq as well, he does not, the U.S. government, the foreign policy, the U.S. corporations do not allow democratically elected governments to function. For example, in Iraq, majority of people want a timetable for the U.S. troops to withdraw.
Yeah, they all want
the majority of Iraqi parliamentarians who were elected with great celebration by the Bush
Remember
administration.
the purple finger?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Majority of parliamentarians want a timetable for the U.S. to pull out.
Yeah.
Why? Because they cannot govern.
Yeah.
With the U.S. occupiers.
It's been a crapshoot where they came up snake eyes on both cases. Iraq is a mess. It's a mess. And the thing that was happening, a lot of people think that attack on Hezbollah, they thought they were going to be able to wipe them out like that, like they've been able to do with their air power, their superpower, and it came a cropper. And Mr. Ahmadinejad is still doing the thing as far as the atomic development, and they're still going to be supporting it. So it's been twice they've rolled the dice and lost.
And it's
big
very
time,
dangerous.
2 times,
It's
2
a very
places.
dangerous moment.
And it makes it very dangerous, but it's also danger brings opportunity. And maybe there's going to be something blowing in the wind among the masses. Maybe it's too much to think, because we live in a world which has always been ruled by a few people who ruled everybody else, and the people were wallowing around in the mud. You had a few kings in the castle and emperors in Rome and so forth. And you've always had that. And now you got financial people, and they got this idea. They say, we are legitimate. There's going to be a context coming out of the people.
That's right.
It's happening in Latin America. It's happening maybe in Indonesia. It's happening in the Muslim world against that.
And it's happening in our
and
country.
That it may, and it's happening in our country with people like United for Peace and Justice, that maybe it's going to be a thing where they're going to be able, instead of allowing them to assume a historical legitimacy, it's going to be questioned, the legitimacy fundamentally of what it is they represent. And that goes back beyond one policy of one war or one country. It's the basic principles by which the world is assumed to be able to be organized according to principles where a few people can live in gated communities while everybody else starves. That should be questioned, do you think?
Absolutely.
And maybe the context is there to have that happen.
Exactly. The World Social Forums that have been being organized year after year are a place where people are getting together, questioning and putting forward alternatives. But as well, we have to look at how you become politically empowered. What happens in our country to begin with? The whole world is counting on us.
Who's us? You mean the peace movement in America?
The American people. The American people.
Well,
the whole world is counting on us to change the nature of our government.
Well, I've been very upset with a good deal of what the American people allowed to happen.
Well,
they just sat on their hands while we invaded Iraq with all this, and and nothing. It went on, and they voted appropriation. It's going to be close to $1 trillion that it's going to cost for that stupid thing in Iraq.
That's what organizers have to do. We have to organize.
But do you know how many appropriations bills were allowed to go through the Congress by Democrats sitting on their hands with no opposition? You had one guy against the Patriot Act, the whole attack on civil liberties, the whole thing that's been allowed to go,
that
and there are more of them.
For office. It's people like yourself,
not for office,
and people who are actively involved in dealing with problems in our communities that should be elected to Congress. We are the people who should be determining not only domestic policy but foreign policy.
But wait a minute, if you're going to be elected to Congress, and what you're talking about, you're not talking about a war that is wrong, or maybe you are. You're talking about that you could say Vietnam, we retreat. What you're talking about in a certain sense, if you're talking about the big one, what you're talking about is the idea of the legitimacy, the assumed legitimacy of the United States of America. We made a revolution 229 years ago.
It was a good one. I supported that revolution.
Well, might have been. That would have been. I was around like that. But they did that. But they had 800 years. They'd had feudalism held in Europe, and that was the way people got identity. Then you get an industrial revolution coming, a steam engine. You get the Scottish Enlightenment. They made a revolution here. It was still, Charles Beard will tell us, the economic interpretation, it was still rich people and so, but they made it, and that informed the Miserables in France, and they made a revolution, cut off Louis XVI's head, and those people had represented the Ancien regime. You know the term, Ancien regime? This country now, and it's not just the Republicans, it's not just the neocons, it's the system. The architecture, the institutions, the relationships, the economic theory,
we need a revolution.
Everything
we need a revolution.
That
You're right.
It is an ancien regime that is out of date with what is required. So that's what I'm questioning at that level. Is that maybe that's what's coming, revolutionary, not evolutionary changes on the margin, revolutionary question of the assumptions by which this country is, the world is to be run. And what are the alternatives to the one which is being perpetrated by the neocons and the oligarchy and so forth? What is it? You have a feeling for a socialist reading of society, a Marxian reading of society? Is it that kind of a revolution that's required for, and maybe finally coming to be available to us? A real qualitative change that can bring justice rather than this limping along just with gated communities of people getting rich at the expense of the masses. What do you think?
I think you have studied a great deal of history, and that revolution doesn't happen with evolution. There are steps, baby steps, and then big leaps that happen all through the course of history.
It's like
I believe that this movement that's grown up very spontaneously and in an organized way against the immoral war in Iraq is the basis of a whole new level of understanding and organized political empowerment to change the direction the government's going in. I think the 2006
the
elections,
world is going.
the government, U.S. government, and therefore the world. I think that the 2006 elections is one of those evolutionary changes where we're putting the war to a referendum. I don't think it's going to bring an end to the war, but I do believe that people are beginning to say, wait a minute, who should be running the government? 500 years the system has been, over 500 years, the system has been functioning and it hasn't solved some basic problems. Those statistics that came out yesterday about the poverty, the level of poverty in this country.
Inherent contradictions, I think Mr. Marx called it.
I think that United for Peace and Justice is a form where people are working together to end this war, and people are drawing conclusions about why this war started, what is its relationship to the history of U.S. foreign policy, and what should we do? I personally, myself, have a belief that the capitalism doesn't work. I represent the coalition, and I speak in the name of the coalition. And my political organization, of course, who I represent on the steering committee, is the Communist Party. We do have an analysis. I am a communist.
I've never met a commie I didn't like, I don't
think. Me neither.
Right.
But
or a hippie. I like most of the hippies, too.
I think that the Marxists and the left in this country derive tremendous strength from being in touch with people at the grassroots and talking out some of these complicated problems that we're discussing today, and helping people understand that it's not just a few bad apples like the neocons.
It's systemic.
That there is this drive to control the world that flows out of this system.
Yeah.
Now,
and it's time for something brand new.
I do not say that United for Peace and Justice is a left coalition at all.
You don't.
It brings together people left, center, and some people even voted for Bush.
You got some libertarians in there?
I'm sure we have quite a few, but the truth is this, that's the power of an organized movement, is that you bring people together on what we agree upon. And that is what is scary to the Bush administration, that there is a growing cross-section of people, some who voted for Bush, all the way over to communists, who agree that this war needs to end, that it's stripping justice at home, it's stripping our civil liberties, and it's not only costing money, but it's costing people's lives, and it's harming our morality.
And it's
when
also
war crimes are committed, and people see what's going on at Guantanamo. They say, where's the moral compass? Where is this civilization going?
Yeah, that's right.
And that now maybe I have to step up. And it is very inspiring to me to go to small towns and to cities to talk to people who say things like, I have been standing in my neighborhood every Friday night, vigiling for over 3 years. I see the change in the attitude of the people who drive by, people who honk, who throw the peace sign at, who signify. And I think we have to break the silence. We have to give people an optimistic starting point that we can change the direction the country's going in, but it's going to take political empowerment. It's going to take people getting involved. I think Jonathan Tassini is doing a great service to put the issue out there that we have to end the war, and that it's fundamentally an issue that needs to be debated in the Senate race.
He's not going to be able to win the
but
election.
The debate. And democracy is premised on being educated about the issues and having dialogue and debate.
You said before about having people in Congress, and if the system that's in place, and the thing is, if you're in place, it would have been like being in the, at the Palace of Versailles. It's the system in place. It's not in the people. Mr. Palais says it's the best Congress money can buy. It's all money, and they're all stuffing money into their pockets, so they're all implicated. You don't want to be in there. You're not going to get answers from there. The answers are going to have to come from people that are from outside of that. And then the final really challenge, we were just talking to Frank Morales, the real challenge is you got to come up with an alternative that is liberating of the masses. The times require, when you got weapons that can destroy the species, you've got to come up with an ontology or an understanding that can be liberating of the human spirit, of everybody, rather than just a few, people that are advantaged and so forth, that's been throughout history, plus the ecological context, and a realization that we have a capability of liberating the masses of the people in a way that is called for and is required, but it's got to be the ultimate challenge to be a system that's going to be so appropriate to evolution of universal consciousness that it will, in the end, be able to be understood by and gone along with the people in Congress or in the halls of business leadership, but you can't expect any answers to come from them. You can't expect answers from them. You can only expect finally to have a system that they will be able to understand in the end. But in the end, they are going to be a lagging indicator. The more ensconced they are in the system, the less they're going to be able to see the end. It's going to have to come from the intellectual community to provide an alternative that can turn on the masses, and then finally, and in the end, incorporate the so-called leaders that we see parading across our newspaper headlines and the television. It's not going to come from them or from the Congress. I do not think. It's going to come from the intellectuals, I think. And they're
I don't know if it's
and
going to come from the intellectuals.
Leaders?
I don't know if it's going to come from the intellectuals.
Having spent a lot of time in those quarters, yeah.
But the key is, when you look at any neighborhood or community struggle, when you look at any local union and the things that people are facing in the workplace and how it's addressed, the starting point is that people who lead must be accountable. Because policies, decisions, and the defense of people's rights have to be determined by what the people want and what they need.
If you notice the lack of accountability of this current gang down there in Washington, it's really absurd. Well,
and we've got to put
We've only got a couple of minutes left, Judith, and so we got to make sure we get a couple of practical things down. Your website and the fact you've got a demonstration going, and what's the date, what's the situation, where is it, lay it out for people, and then we got to make sure we give them plenty of chance to get to your website.
Yes. People need to go to unitedforpeace.org.
Say it again,
United for Peace, one word, .org.
Okay.
Because there you will see the whole calendar of events.
We've got it up on the scene. They can see it. They
Fantastic.
Can see it now. Yeah.
You will see there a whole calendar of activities between now and Election Day that people can become involved in.
Okay.
We're involved in a project called the Declaration of Peace.
Okay.
And
good idea.
This is that we're doing a lot of visitations, pressure tactics to on Congress people while they've been at home on vacation, but we will also be calling for, in September, the last month that they'll be in session.
What's the date? What's the date?
It's September 21st through
the
27th. Totally set. Many organizations around the country.
Do it again. September what?
21st through the 27th.
21st? That's a long time. What do you mean? It's a whole series of things?
It's a series of things. Local actions to put the issue of the war front and center in the local congressional campaigns, and on the doorsteps of congressional representatives. And then we're going to take it on the road to go to Capitol Hill to do nonviolent direct action aimed at the leadership of the Senate and the House.
Big push, huh?
Exactly. Yeah. And we want people of conscience to come with us to D.C. There's going to be about 15 decorated Iraq war veterans who have not been involved in the peace movement up until now.
And is there going to be a one-day demonstration?
They're going to turn back.
Is there going to be a day that is going to be a demonstration?
Yes,
on
September
the mall?
26th and 27th. Direct action on Capitol Hill.
When is the demo?
It's not a demo. It's direct action, nonviolent direct action.
Okay.
We're trying to up the ante. We're trying to get the people who are so morally upset by the situation, by the direction of the Bush administration, the fact that the war continues, people continue to die.
Yeah.
We're taking it to the Hill. We're going to have Iraq war veterans who are going to turn back their medals, people who've never been a part of the peace movement up till now. And it'll be a day where we're saying the war
has got to
end,
okay.
and we're hoping for
to the barricades.
Exactly.
Okay, thanks, Don. I'm sorry we're running out of time. Your pleasure to set with Judith LeBlanc, and they're doing great work, Uniting for Peace and Justice, and it's a great organization, and it's the hope of the world.